common myth about the history of the SU-152 heavy howitzer is the assertion that they were created as a response to the appearance of the enemy's new heavy tank, the Tiger. Although the good anti-tank capabilities of the 152mm heavy self-propelled guns, due to their high muzzle velocity and the large mass of shells for the ML-20 gun, are obvious, but the main purpose of this type of vehicles was artillery support for tank and mechanized units of the Red Army. The development of the SU-152 started in 1942, and the first Tiger tank was captured near Leningrad in early 1943, so it could not have any influence on the development of the SU-152. However, even before the appearance of the Tiger tanks on the battlefield, in order to increase the morale of the Soviet troops, the SU-152 was widely used in leaflets and propaganda films. These propaganda activities formed the basis of this belief. The combat debut of the SU-152 self-propelled heavy howitzer was the Battle of Kursk, where only 24 vehicles were used, so the personnel of the Red Army in its mass did not see those vehicles before and during the battle. Due to the small number, they did not play a significant role on the scale of the entire battle. However, the importance of their presence cannot be questioned. They were used to a greater extent as tank destroyers, since they were the only available Soviet armored vehicles that could effectively deal with new and modernized German tanks at almost any distance. It is worth noting that despite of the popular belief, most of the German armored vehicles in the German Panzer divisions were not Tiger tanks and Panther tanks, but modernized Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. There were only about 150 Tiger tanks, about 200 Panther tanks, and about 90 Ferdinand heavy tank destroyers in the battle. They were the main opponents of the 24 SU-152 howitzers. Nevertheless, German medium tanks were formidable opponents, since their frontal armor was brought up to 80 mm. At a distance of over 300 meters, they were practically impenetrable for the Soviet 76 mm anti-tank guns. The 152 mm projectiles of the SU-152, due to their large mass and kinetic energy, had a high destructive potential, and the consequences of their direct hits on an armored vehicle were very serious. Since there was a shortage of Soviet armor-piercing shells in 1943, concrete-piercing and often high-explosive fragmentation shells were used. The latter also had a good effect on armored targets. Although they did not penetrate thick armor, they easily damaged the gun, the sight, and the chassis of enemy vehicles. Moreover, to disable an enemy tank or self-propelled gun, it was enough for a high-explosive fragmentation projectile to hit the target's vicinity. For example, the crew of Major Sankovsky, the commander of one of the SU-152 batteries and one of the Soviet tank aces of the Second World War, knocked out 10 enemy tanks in one day and received the Order of the Red Banner. The number of enemy vehicles destroyed or damaged by the SU-152 fire varies greatly among different authors, but basically 12 Tigers and 7 Ferdinands are mentioned. not counting other German armored vehicles. However, this figure cannot be taken for granted, since in the Red Army any German self-propelled gun was called Ferdinand, and the Panzer IV tanks with side armor or skirts, which greatly changed their appearance, were often taken for Tiger tanks. But the effectiveness of the SU-152 on enemy morale was relatively high, and these vehicles played an important role in raising the morale of the Soviet troops, who often became victims of the Tiger and Ferdinand fear. Before the start of the Battle of the Kursk, the Voronezh front had one heavy self-propelled artillery regiment with SU-152s. This regiment was part of the 7th Guards Army. Tactically, it was subordinated to the 101st Separate Tank Brigade, equipped with British Matilda infantry tanks. The SU-152s of the regiment was actively used in battles with German troops belonging to Army Group Kampf. Mainly, self-propelled guns were used for firing from closed firing positions, but there were also cases of direct fire at enemy tanks. Later, the regiment was withdrawn and reassigned to the 5th Guards Tank Army. It was planned to take part in the well-known counterattack near Prokhorovka, but the regiment arrived in its initial positions only in the evening of the 12th of July and without shells, and therefore it did not take part in the battles on that day. During the offensive phase of the Battle of Kursk, the SU-152s also performed well as mobile heavy artillery for reinforcing the tank and rifle units of the Red Army. They often fought in the first lines of the advancing forces, but there is also evidence that they were used as originally planned as a means of fire support in the second line, and therefore the survival rate of the crews was much higher. In the summer of 1943, the Wehrmacht managed to capture at least one SU-152 and examine the vehicle in detail. Photos of captured self-propelled guns with a brief description were published in the illustrated comic guide to the combat use of the Panther tank, which was called Panther Feber and which was published in 1944.